Well, we are continuing with the series we're doing from March, talking about the way we look at Lent in unity. And for us, it's not about fasting from food or giving up things that we like. It's an opportunity for us to sharpen our focus and our spiritual practice by fasting from negative thoughts, negative ideas, and then putting more energy into working on ways to expand our circle of caring and compassion in the world. I heard someone suggest a neat little mnemonic device to remember how we think of Lent in unity, and it goes like this: let's eliminate negative thinking. I think that works really well. And that's a start, but we don't just want to eliminate. As I said, we eliminate, we make space, and then we fill it with something positive. We make something positive and life-affirming as part of our practice. And so that's why we're drawing on ideas from two books. First of all, Keep a True Lent by Unity co-founder Charles Fillmore, and then The Four Agreements by Don Miguel Reese. And today we're looking at the third agreement, which is don't make assumptions. And I'm going to start by not assuming that everyone knows what an assumption is. So here's the dictionary definition. It's the act of taking for granted or supposing, arrogance, presumption. Okay, I think we can all agree that things like taking things for granted and arrogance and presumption are not good things to practice. But what about supposing? What's wrong with that? The scientific method of inquiry starts with a supposition or an assumption. They call it a hypothesis. A hypothesis, easy for me to say. There's an old story about Galileo. Back in the 1500s, most people simply assumed that a heavier object would fall faster than a lighter object. Now, there's nothing wrong with that assumption as long as you can prove it. Find some evidence that proves that it's true. And Galileo was actually the first person to attempt to prove or disprove that assumption. And when he did the math and a few experiments, he proved that this long-standing assumption was simply wrong. Things fall at the same rate regardless of how much they weigh. So there's one assumption right out the window. Or how about this assumption? The assumption that the sun revolves around the earth. Because, hey, that's what it said in the Bible, right? And the modern equivalent of it is this thing that we see on bumper stickers here. It says, God said it, I believe it, that settles it, right? Ever seen one of these bumper stickers? That's the modern day equivalent of the supposition back there in Galileo's day. Don't you dare test it or question it if it's in the Bible. And besides what God said in the Bible, when you stand outside and you look at the sky, well, you actually see clearly that the sun is moving across the sky, right? And we're standing still. You can't feel any motion. That's what it feels like. So we're safe in assuming that the sun revolves around the earth, right? We're never safe in simply assuming. It's never safe to just assume without any additional steps. Oscar Wilde is quoted as once saying that when you assume, you make an ass out of you and me. Okay, you've heard this little cliche before? That's what we mean by that. It's never safe to assume. We have to go beyond the initial assumption and get proof. And if the evidence contradicts our assumption, then we dump the assumption. Unfortunately, human beings get attached to their assumptions. So much so, we recall that when Galileo tried to present evidence that the earth revolved around the sun, he was convicted of heresy. He was placed under house arrest for the rest of his life. Assumptions masquerading as knowledge are dangerous things, especially when they fly in the face of evidence to the contrary. Another word for this kind of assumption or blind faith is simply belief. A belief without anything behind it. Back in 1877, there was an English mathematician and philosopher who wrote an essay called The Ethics of Belief, and he made a rather strong statement on this subject. He said, "It is wrong, always, everywhere, and for anyone to believe anything upon insufficient evidence." So, when we use the word assumption here in this context, we're talking about blind faith or beliefs without proof, pretending to know something when we don't, when we have no justification or proof. So in his book, The Four Agreements, Don Miguel Ruiz says this. He says, "Whenever we make assumptions, we are asking for problems. All the sadness and drama you have lived in your life was rooted in making assumptions and taking things personally." Last week we talked about taking things personally. They go together. Making assumptions, taking things personally cause a lot of problems and drama in our life. So, if we see that these assumptions cause so many problems, why do we do it? Socrates once said that the only reason that he could be considered wise was because he knew that he knew nothing at all. The only time that we're really learning anything is when we are pushed to the very edge of our knowledge reservoir and into that uncomfortable realm of doubt and uncertainty and not knowing. Not knowing. It's uncomfortable. That's why human beings prefer certainty, even if it means guessing or just plain making stuff up. We love the feeling of being in control, even if it's only an illusion. And I would say 99.9% of the time it is an illusion. The biggest and most dangerous assumption that human beings make is that everyone else in the world sees life the same way that we do. That's one of our biggest major assumptions. And there's a quote I like from Unity author Eric Butterworth. He said, "We don't see the world as it is. We see the world as we are." That's why it can be so difficult for us to take the perspective of another person. It's a skill that we have to develop because we're not born with it. We're not born with that skill. You ever watch a group of toddlers playing out on the playground and ever count the number of times the word mine is used? And then I heard about an interesting experiment that someone did with children, showing them a piece of paper like this, just a plain piece of paper, and on one side was a symbol, let's say a circle. On the other side was a triangle. All right, so the experimenter would show the child that, there's a triangle here, the child would know what that is. There's a circle on the other side, the child would know what that is, and this is up to a certain age. So then the experimenter would show the child this picture here, and would ask the child, "What symbol am I looking at?" And invariably, the child would say that the experimenter was looking at the same shape that the child was. Because they hadn't yet learned how to step into another person's position or another person's perspective. We're not born with it. And try the same test with an adult, and odds are everyone's going to be able to accurately predict what picture each person is looking at. But there are other areas where we remain stuck in one-sided thinking. Sometimes the skill is underdeveloped in adults. For example, last year we were studying the 21 skills of spiritual intelligence, and we spent some time talking about the importance of being aware of multiple worldviews, which is really what this is all about. Being aware of other worldviews and understanding that not everyone sees the world the same way that we do. Our own worldview is really the product of our own genetic makeup, of our cultural conditioning, that process that they call domestication in the Four Agreements. Those are the things that create our worldview. Our assumptions are based on our worldview. So, imagine an office where they're having a big reception, a big employee reception, and you have people from different countries at this reception. So there's a female employee from North America, and there's a male employee who's from Brazil. When they're introduced, the male stands very close to her, say 6 to 10 inches. That's not what we're used to in this country, is it? She's more used to something along the lines of maybe 18 to 24 inches, which is the acceptable space according to our worldview. So what does she do? She steps back. What does the fellow from Brazil do? He closes the distance. And all of a sudden she's making assumptions. She's thinking, well, is he hitting on me? If you can't take another person's worldview, we make assumptions. Is he hitting on me? And perhaps she starts to feel a little bit angry, maybe even threatened or intimidated. She finds the first opportunity to break off the conversation. Well, now he makes an assumption, right, that she's being rude. Or maybe she doesn't like people from South America, things like that, right? What we have here is a clash of worldviews. Or, remember this guy from the movie Cool Hand Luke? Remember what he said? He said, what we got here is failure to communicate. Failure to communicate. It's just like our meet and greet here in the morning. We're huggers in unity. That's part of our worldview. That's part of our culture, but not everyone shares that. So we try not to assume that everyone does, and we attempt to clearly communicate that handshake or a hug, be aware of other worldviews. We want to communicate clearly up front. So in the Four Agreements, Don Miguel says that during our domestication, we actually make agreements to not communicate. We have agreed that it's not safe to ask questions. We have agreed that if people love us, they should know what we want or how we feel. I understand that this last one can sometimes show up in relationships. It can actually be a major communication barrier in relationships. It goes something like this, honey, is something wrong? And the response is, well, if you don't know, I'm not telling you. I know, that's an exaggeration, but you get what I mean. So here's the solution. Don Miguel gives us the solution. He says, the way to keep yourself from making assumptions is ask questions. Have the courage to ask questions until you are as clear as you can be. And even then, do not assume you know all there is to know about a given situation. The power of questions can extend to every aspect of our relationships. Not just interpersonal relationships, but our relationship with reality itself. The whole unity movement came to be because Charles and Myrtle Fillmore dared to question the beliefs and the assumptions of traditional Christianity. They were running a laboratory, not a museum. Truth to them wasn't truth unless it was practical. You had to prove it. You had to prove that it worked in the world, and that doesn't happen unless we're willing to ask questions and test things. Sometimes we say that unity is the place we go to get our answers questioned. Something else that can help us to avoid assumptions is this. He says, find your voice to ask for what you want. Everybody has the right to tell you no or yes, but you always have the right to ask. Isn't that interesting? We're afraid to ask. The one thing we can do to help to counteract making assumptions is to ask, and we're afraid to do it. We're afraid to ask for help. Why is that? Well, more hidden assumptions. For instance, maybe I'm thinking at a level that I'm not aware of. If I ask for help, well, others might see me as weak or needy. Or here's a big one. I can't ask for help because I'm not worthy of their time or their effort. Did you know those things might be lurking beneath the surface? Can you see how this process might lead to more questions and take us deeper. Where do these messages come from? Where do these messages begin? The ones where we think that people might see us as weak or needy, or where we think of ourselves as unworthy. And now let's flip it around. Instead of looking at the assumptions we make about ourselves, what is it that we might be assuming about others when we don't ask for help when we need it? Maybe something like, well, I'm not asking for help because basically people are selfish, or they don't care, or they're just in it for themselves. I don't want someone to help me on this project because I'm afraid they'll take all the credit, or I'll have to share the credit. All of these things that might be bubbling underneath, and we'll never get at it unless we're willing to ask a question as to why am I reluctant? What are the old tapes that I'm playing? Where is this coming from? What we end up doing is having to look at a lot of emotional garbage. I mean, look at the emotional garbage and the error thinking that can come up when we learn how to ask powerful, probing questions like this. You know, it's another example of something else that we do during the Lent season. Spring cleaning, right? We're clearing out the subconscious mind. We're getting rid of anything that might stand in the way of discovering our own inherent worth, assumptions that might be standing in our way. We're eliminating anything that might stand in the way of seeing and appreciating the worthiness in others. So think of it as spiritual spring cleaning. Next week, the last agreement, which is always do your best. And we'll see you then. Thank you.